Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Great. Well, my name is Zach, and I'm excited to be able to continue our series today. If you were with us last week, we introduced our new series for the next couple of weeks called Surprise the World, and we are looking at how we as followers of Jesus are called to be more missional, how we're called to live life on purpose, right? We have a different set of priorities as followers of Jesus. We live our lives in different ways, and Jesus calls us, he invites us to be on mission with him. And so because of that, we surprise the world in a different way, because the way that we live as followers of Jesus is not the same way that people around us live. And today, and over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk just about a couple of different missional habits, things that we can do. Hint, these are things that you're probably already doing. We just do them in a little bit different way. And through just simply altering some of these habits that we have, we can, in fact, surprise the world. My question for you this morning is, have you ever been invited over to somebody's house for dinner, and you think it's just to hang out, and you get there and you begin to have dinner, and then in the middle of dinner, you kind of realize oh, they're trying to sell me something, right? Or maybe you get that Facebook message from that high school friend that you kind of knew but didn't really talk to, right? And they want you to, invest in this new company, and you can be rich too. Sometimes I think this is how we treat telling people about Jesus, right? That we kind of have this old bait and switch, we're going to do something and then we're going to surprise them with Jesus, right? I think this is sometimes how we view evangelism, and we think that we kind of have to trick people into letting us tell them about Jesus. But when we follow the life of Jesus himself, when we read through the New Testament, we see that Jesus, in fact, never does this, right? He doesn't do the old switcheroo, right? He doesn't surprise them, right? He just lives a different way. He had a method, he has a plan, but people knew what they were getting into, right? And so the habit that we're going to talk about today is something that I love to do: eat. Today we're going to be talking about eating, right? So when we see Jesus in the New Testament, there's a couple things that we can recognize, that we can pattern our lives with around this idea of eating, right? Twice in the Gospel of Luke, right, when we see Jesus, right, there are two references that we see specifically with this kind of formula, and that formula is the Son of Man came, right? The Son of Man is a reference to Jesus. It's a reference that he used often about himself, and we see this twice happening in the Gospel according to Luke. The first one is in Luke 19, verse 10, and it says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." This was Jesus' mission, right? Jesus came to earth. He was born on that Christmas morning, right? He lived his life, and his whole purpose was to seek and to save the lost. And so when we talk about being missional people, this is the mission that we are invited into, right? That Jesus invites us into. He was on that mission. He's still on that mission today, and he invites us as his followers into mission with him. So how did he do this? How did he accomplish? The second way that this little formula is used is in Luke 7, verse 34. It says, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking." You see, Jesus changed the world because of who he ate with. Jesus changed the world by who he ate with. Author and scholar Robert Karris says that in Luke's gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or just coming from a meal. And so when you read through the book of Luke, you actually see that Jesus spent a large portion of his ministry eating. And so this is somebody I can get behind, because I love to eat as well, right? It's something we all do, right? We all eat. And what I want to establish for us today is that there is, in fact, something spiritual about the way that we eat, right? Jesus' whole method into how to bring people into relationship with himself was by eating with them. So why is this important for us even today? right? In society, especially during Jesus' time, but even still today, who you eat with, who you share a meal with, is something that we would call a boundary marker, right? It signifies your social standing, where you are on the ladder, right? Meals bring people together, but it keeps people apart, right? Generally, we only eat with friends, family, and people who are like us. And no clearly do we see this than in a middle school cafeteria. There's a show that Al and I love to watch, and it's called The Middle. If you have ever watched it before, you know that it's about this average Midwestern family, right, just trying to get through life. And there's an episode early on where the middle daughter, Sue, she's in middle school, and they're kind of starting to look forward to high school. And it talks about how in their middle school cafeteria, there was the A table and the B table and the C table and the D table. And so this episode is all about how Sue and her friend are trying to make a run at a B table so that they can enter high school at a higher social standing. And so the episode goes along, and the people at the B table actually leave to go to an A table, right? And so no clearer do we see this idea that who we eat with signifies kind of our boundaries, right? It kind of identifies our social standing. But you see, when Jesus came, when Jesus lived his mission on earth, he turned this social stigma on his head, right? Time and time again, we see Jesus eating meals with people that the Jewish society had deemed unclean, sinners, people who a Jewish rabbi would have had no business eating with. Right? We see this in so many stories throughout the New Testament, right? We see this with Jesus and Zacchaeus, right? When he goes to the tax collector's house, right? And so often the Pharisees attack Jesus and attack his followers because he chose to eat with people who they did not think that was right. Right? One author I read recently said that Jesus actually got himself crucified because of who he chose to eat with. But this was Jesus' method of seeking and saving the lost, to eat with them. And so what would happen if we were to take this practice of eating, something we do all the time, and began to implement it in a way that would cause us to surprise the world? What if we began to slowly change our community because we simply chose to eat with people in a different way? What if we began to practice, as author and speaker Rosaria Butterfield put it, radically ordinary hospitality? Here's what I mean. Chances are, a lot of you are like me. If you know me, you know that I am an introvert, that I like to have my space and my time. And so chances are, especially if you're like me, your house, your home is your castle, right? It's where we go to get away from everything, right? I would love nothing more than to be able to drive into my driveway and to park and to flip a little wave to my neighbors and walk inside, and after a long day of work, just hide from the world, right? In reality, this is how most of us act, right? It is that our home is the place that we can control. Our home is the place that we feel safe. It's a place that we go to escape and to hide from the world. As someone who works on a lot of houses, I get to see a wide gamut of houses. And one of the biggest things that I notice when I'm working on, say, a house that is, 75 to 100 years old versus one that was built in the last 10 to 20 years is the location of the porch. If you drive through the old parts of Cleveland, you see all these houses, and they're all lined up. Their backyards are pretty small. But all of those houses, they have a giant porch out front. And that's because it used to be that you would sit out on your front porch, and your neighbors would walk by, and you could just sit on your porch, and as people walk by, you could just kind of strike up a conversation. You would start to talk, right? And it was just kind of this informal relationship building. But as time went on, and so especially in the houses that we build today, our porches, our decks are in the backyard, sometimes fenced in. And it's a place that we can control, where we can hide, where we get to exclusively invite people, right? People can't just walk by and invite themselves in their backyard. We usually call the police if you do that. But what if we were simply to change the way, again, that we just shared meals, that we ate, that we kind of reclaim this idea of inviting people just organically in to eating with us? Pastor John Tyson, he begs the question. He says, what if our homes stopped being places we hid from the world, but places where the world comes to for healing? Right? When we talk about being missional, we talk about being on mission for Jesus, a lot of times we take that to mean outside of our home, right? That we go serve in our community, right? You guys all know that Starting Line Church has a great partnership with the school. And so, right, being at the school, right, helping out with those events, that's all being missional, right? When we go to the grocery store, like those are all great missional things. But oftentimes we fall into the trap that mission happens outside of our home and not in and through our home. So what does this mean for us? What I want to talk about today is 3 meals that we can eat that would begin to radically change our communities around us. And the good news is, unless you're a weird person that doesn't eat breakfast, we all have 21 meals a day, or a week. A day. That would be great. 21 meals a week. And so what if we just took 3 of those and just changed how we did it? I know that our communities, our neighborhoods would just begin to change 1 meal at a time, and it would be awesome. So the first meal that I would love for us to be able to include in our weekly rhythm is a habit of eating with the lost. Right, the same way that Jesus came to say that he came to seek and to save the lost, right? The lost means simply people who are just looking for more, right? Lost is not a bad thing, right? Lost people are not bad. Lost people are not evil. Fact is, we all are lost at some point in our lives, right? Sometimes when we go to a new city or a new state or we're on vacation, sometimes we get lost, right? It's okay. But the fact of the matter is people, our neighbors, our communities are searching for something more. They're longing for something more. And so we get to join with Jesus in helping to seek and to bring them into relationship with Jesus. Right? In a world that is increasingly hostile to the gospel of Jesus, right? The best way that we can reach lost people for Jesus is to eat with them, right? As I said earlier, there's something deeply spiritual about eating, right? There's something that happens. We all know this. There's something that happens when we sit down to a meal, right? There's oftentimes there's walls that come down, right? There's a certain level of comfort that happens when we sit around a table together. Right, because eating is actually a deeply spiritual practice, right? Obviously, there's physical, goodness for that, right? We all need to eat to live and to survive. But there's something so much deeper that happens when we choose to share a meal with someone. Now, when we talk about this, right, when we talk about eating with the lost, there's an important distinction that I want to make for us this morning. When Jesus and the New Testament writers talk about eating with the lost, the word that they use is hospitality. But unfortunately, when we think about having people over for dinner, we move from hospitality to entertainment. Here's the difference between the two. Entertainment-based meals are often an event on the calendar. It's something you plan for weeks. You spend all day cleaning your house, right? You make sure that you have the matching dishware out from, well, if you're like me, IKEA or wherever, right? You have everything matches, everything looks great. And while that's great, when Jesus and the New Testament writers talk about hospitality, I don't think that's what he had in mind, right? He didn't have in mind pictures of these meals out of, a magazine or that you would see on TV, right? Hospitality-based meals are often more spontaneous. It's a little more disorganized. Your house is probably going to be a mess. Not everything's going to match. You might even break a plate. It's okay. Eating with the lost isn't always an event that you plan for, but it's an opportunity for you to invite other people into the chaos of our lives. All of our lives are chaos. It is. We all know. We all admit it. But we get to invite other people into that chaos and just simply share a meal with them, right? It's raw, it's chaotic, but it's one of the most beautiful things that can happen. So that's the first meal that I would love for us, right? To think of somebody who's a neighbor, a coworker, that just on a random day you can say, hey, you want to come eat a meal? You know, I get home from work at 5, let's eat at 5:30, right? You don't have that time to get your house all ready, right? People actually want to see that rawness. They want to see that, hey, as followers of Jesus, we don't always have our lives together too. Sometimes that's what we project. But when we can invite people into the rawness of our life, walls begin to break down and the opportunity begins to present itself. That we just get to share Jesus with them. Secondly, we should eat with the family. In Acts chapter 2, we see a glimpse into the early Christians' lifestyle. We read this in Acts chapter 2. It says, all the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. A deep sense of awe came over them all, and the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders, and all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple every day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity. Do you see it 3 times in this passage, right? When you want, when the Bible was written, they didn't have bold and italics, and they didn't circle things. If you wanted to get a point across, you repeated it over and over. And so 3 times in this short passage, we see that the early believers shared a lot of meals together, right? They worshiped in the temple, right? They gave to those they served. But the thing that is repeated the most is that they ate meals with great joy and generosity. Because meals catalyze community. Right? Because meals take strangers and turn them into friends who then turn into family. A few years ago, an article came out in The Atlantic, and this article was highlighting a bunch of the research that had been done specifically talking about the importance of families eating meals together, right? In the article, it highlighted and showed the direct correlation between how often a family would eat together and how the children would perform in a variety of categories, including academically, socially, even athletically. And it showed a direct correlation between the more often that a family sat down and had a meal together, the more likely these children would excel. So I have to believe if this is true for a family unit, for an immediate family, how much more is this important for us as the family of God? Right? If we want to grow in our faith, if we want to progress on our journey with Jesus, a practice that we have to reclaim is the ability to share meals with the family of God. If you've been with Starting Line Church for any length of time, you know that anytime we kind of have a big event, one of the things we often have is food, right? Some of that is practically. But part of that reason is because it's so important for us as the family of God, right? Every once in a while, to share a meal together. Because if any of you have ever been part of that, you know what happens during those meals, right? We get to talking, and sometimes we start sharing things about our life, maybe that aren't going super well. And then everyone else at the table kind of gets to encourage you, follow up with you in the weeks to come. All right? This Sunday morning is great, right? We love doing this. We love coming together for an hour on Sunday mornings. But if we want to go deeper, if we want to grow, a practice that we can introduce into our lives is the idea of eating together. Another recent study suggests that the happiest points in a human being's life is when they are around a table with family and friends. There's science to prove that, which is great. This is why I think Thanksgiving and Christmas meals are so great, why we love them so much, because we're sitting around a table having a meal with family and friends. There's something special. There's something spiritual that happens there. Even if everyone around that table isn't even a follower of Jesus, there's something, right? We can all agree with that. There's something special that happens around a table with family and friends. And so I think this is something that we can do as followers of Jesus, is not only eating a meal with the lost, but there's people in this room that you can eat with, right? I'm sure you know other people, right? Coworkers, friends, families that are followers of Jesus, that it would be great once a week to share a meal with someone, to catch up, to just live life together. Lastly, the third meal that we eat, we call eating with God. Generally, when we hear this idea of eating with God, oftentimes we think of communion. And if you look at your tables, this is something we're going to do together in just a little bit. But this wasn't always the case, right? When Jesus instituted communion, his original idea was not for us to have a slice of bread and a little glass of juice at church on Sunday mornings. Right? Listen to Luke chapter 22. It says, when the time came, Jesus and the apostles sat down together at the table. Jesus said, I have been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. For I tell you now that I won't eat this meal again until its meaning is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Then he took a cup of wine, gave thanks to God for it. Then he said, take this and share it among yourselves, for I will not drink wine again until the kingdom of God has come. He then took some bread, gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it into pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And after supper, he took another cup of wine and said, this cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. There's a lot that we could look into here today, but what I want to draw our attention to is this commonly used phrase, do this in remembrance of me. Two things we need to think about with this phrase in relationship to eating with God. First of all, in the original Greek, when Jesus says, do this, he is not just talking about the bread and the juice. He was actually referring to the entire meal together. What Jesus is getting at is that whenever we sit down to a meal with the family of God, we actually do it in remembrance of him. All right, the presence of Jesus should permeate our meals together. So does that mean we're going to stop doing communion here, with bread and juice? No. But what I'm getting at is that there's something deeper, a deeper practice that we could cultivate, a deeper meaning to communion than just a simple piece of bread and juice on a Sunday morning at church. Secondly, when Jesus says, in remembrance of me, what he doesn't simply mean is in memory of, right? When we eat with Jesus, yes, we look back at what he did, right? We often look back to his sacrifice on the cross, to him rising from the dead 3 days later. But there's something, again, spiritual that happens when we do this, right? We look back, but we also look at the present. We look at and celebrate what Jesus is doing now. But we also look forward, right? Jesus said that he wouldn't share that meal with the disciples again until the new kingdom. And so when we take communion together, we look back, we look here, and we look forward to what is to come. So what if one meal a week you were intentional, right, with your family about just having some type of communion meal together? Right? What if we were intentional instead of, when you gather together with your family, right? Maybe it's just you and your spouse. But what if you were intentional of just one time a week, one of your meals that you sat down together? What if you just began the meal by simply sharing what God has been doing in your life? What if you began by maybe reading, a couple passages of Scripture together? What would that look like? How would that grow our families? If instead of seeing communion as just something that we did every once in a while at church, but once a week we had this type of deep meal where we simply acknowledge the presence of God at our dinner table with our families. A final note before we wrap up. 60 years ago, the average meal time that families shared together was an hour and a half long. Today, that average is 12 minutes. We've gone way down. And so if we're going to do this, if we're going to share these intentional meals, then we've got to make some space in our calendars, because this type of eating is not going to happen in 12 minutes. So what do? I want to give us 3 things to wrap up, 3 things for us to kind of think about over these next couple of weeks as we develop this rhythm of eating. Number 1, the first is just to simply develop a rhythm, right? These types of meals, these 3 meals that we talk about, they're not going to naturally happen. I recently read, actually, Rosaria Butterfield, who I mentioned earlier. She just did an interview a couple of weeks ago, and if you know her story, you know that she was radically changed by simply sharing a meal with followers of Jesus. So go back and read her story. It's incredible. But now her and her husband, they are pastors at a church, and they have a thing where every Thursday night is their meal night with the lost. And what they do is they have just begun sharing with their neighbors. I think they did flyers a couple of times, put them in people's mailbox. But that just every Thursday night during warmer months, they might even live in the South, so it's warm all the time there. But on Thursday nights, they would always grill out on their front porch. And all of their neighbors, all of their family, all of their friends knew that it was an open invitation for them to come and to eat with them. She goes, sometimes nobody shows up. She goes, other weeks, we have 30 or 40. She goes, she talks about this. They just keep a bunch of frozen burgers in the freezer. And just as people come, they throw more on the grill. So develop a rhythm. That's their rhythm. I'm not saying that that's what we need to do, but it would be pretty cool. But develop a rhythm, right? Maybe what's 1 or 2 meals that you can identify every week that, hey, this is a meal that I'm going to try to spend, either having somebody over to my house who maybe doesn't know Jesus, or maybe it's, someone from this room just to catch up. What would that look like? Secondly, this one is funny. Learn to cook. I love restaurants and I love eating out, but the type of conversations generally are not, that we're looking to have with these meals are probably not going to happen in a restaurant. They're just not. There's something about the safety of a home that brings people's walls down. And so I'm not saying that, again, this isn't entertainment. I'm not saying that you need to make these lavish meals. Throw some spaghetti in a pot of boiling water. It's easy. Anybody can do it. But what if we had people over, right? Just learn to cook. Learn to cook. 2 simple meals, right? You can use it all the time. Just have different people over and cook the same meal. It's great, right? Learn to cook 1 or 2 dishes. But invite people in, and those conversations will naturally begin to happen. Third is to identify your targets, right? Last week we said that as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we're called to be missional, right? We're on mission with God and to advance His kingdom. So if we're on mission, that means that we have to have a target, right? We have to have a place that we're going towards, right? And so this is what I want us to do over the next couple of minutes before we take communion together, is that we're going to just take some time, and I don't have pieces of paper, so pull out your phone or whatever. But I want you to just take 3 minutes here real quickly. And I just want you to write down. I actually want you to write it down. You don't have to share it with anybody. You should probably share it with your spouse later, lest they show up and there's just random people at your dinner table. But identify maybe 1 or 2 people that you could have over to your house for a meal in the next week or 2. You can't control whether they can come over, but at least make the invitation. So take these next couple of minutes, and then we're going to come back as way of response, and we're actually going to partake of communion together.